The New York Times has publicly acknowledged that it sends some of its stories to the U.S. government for approval from national security officials before publication. This confirms what veteran New York Times correspondents like James Risen have said. The American newspaper of record regularly collaborates with the U.S. government, suppressing reporting that top officials don't want made public. On June 15th, the Times reported that the U.S. government is escalating its cyber attacks on Russia's power grid. According to the article, quote, "The Trump administration is using new authorities to deploy cyber tools more aggressively as part of their larger digital Cold War between Washington and Moscow." In response to the report, Donald Trump attacked the Times on Twitter, calling the article a virtual act of treason. The New York Times PR office replied to Trump from its official Twitter account, defending the story and noting that it had, in fact, been cleared with the U.S. government before being printed. The Times communications team said, "Accusing the press of treason is dangerous. We described the article to the government before publication. As our story notes, President Trump's own national security officials said there were no concerns." And indeed, the Times report on the escalating American cyber attacks against Russia is attributed to, quote, current and former U.S. government officials. In fact, the scoop came from these apparatchiks, not from a leak or the dogged investigation of an intrepid reporter. The neoliberal self-declared resistance jumped on Trump's reckless accusation of treason. The Democratic coalition, which boasts, "We help run the resistance," responded by calling Trump Putin's puppet. The rest of the corporate media went wild. But what was entirely overlooked was the most revealing thing in the New York Times statement. The newspaper of record was essentially admitting that it has a symbiotic relationship with the U.S. government. Matter of fact, some prominent American pundits have gone so far as to insist that this symbiotic relationship is precisely what makes someone a journalist. In May, neoconservative Washington Post columnist Mark Thesson, a former speechwriter for President George W. Bush, declared that WikiLeaks publisher and political prisoner Julian Assange is, quote, not a journalist. Rather, he's a spy who deserves prison. Thesson's the guy who once called Assange the devil. What was the Post columnist's rationale for revoking Assange's journalistic credentials? Unlike, quote, reputable news organizations, Assange did not give the U.S. government an opportunity to review the classified information WikiLeaks was planning to release so they could raise national security objections. So responsible journalists have nothing to fear. In other words, this former U.S. government speechwriter turned corporate media pundit insists that collaborating with the government and censoring your reporting to protect so-called national security is definitely what makes you a journalist. This is the express ideology of the American news media. The symbiotic relationship between the U.S. corporate media and the government has been known for some time. American intelligence agencies play the press like a musical instrument, using it to selectively leak information at opportune moments to push U.S. soft power and advance Washington's interests. But rarely is this symbiotic relationship so casually and publicly acknowledged. In 2018, former New York Times reporter James Risen published a 15,000-word article in The Intercept providing further insight into how this unspoken alliance operates. Risen detailed how his editors had been, quote, quite willing to cooperate with the government. In fact, a top CIA official even told Risen that his rule of thumb for approving a covert operation was, quote, how will this look on the front page of the New York Times? Risen explained that there's an informal arrangement between the state and the press where U.S. government officials, quote, regularly engage in quiet negotiations with the press to try to stop the publication of sensitive national security stories. The former New York Times reporter said, at the time, I usually went along with these negotiations. He recalled an example of a story he was writing on Afghanistan just prior to the 9/11 attacks, when CIA Director George Tenet called Risen personally and asked him to kill the story. Risen said, quote, he told me the disclosure would threaten the safety of the CIA officers in Afghanistan. And then he said, I agreed. Risen said later that he questioned whether or not this was the right decision. Quote, if I had reported the story before 9/11, the CIA would have been angry, but he said it might have led to a public debate about whether the United States was doing enough to capture or kill bin Laden. He wrote, the public debate might have forced the CIA to take the effort to get bin Laden more seriously. I personally think if they published the story about bin Laden, then bin Laden would not have been pinned as the fall guy, which fits so perfectly in the government's official story. This dilemma led Risen to reconsider responding to U.S. government requests to censor stories. He said, and that ultimately sent me on a collision course with the editors at the New York Times. He said, after the 9/11 attacks, the Bush administration began asking the press to kill stories more frequently. They did it so often that I became convinced the administration was invoking national security just to squash stories that were merely politically embarrassing. In the lead up to the Iraq War, Risen frequently clashed with Times editors because he raised questions about the U.S. government's lies. But his stories raising questions about the intelligence, particularly the administration's claims of a link between Iraq and al-Qaeda, were being cut, buried, or held out of the paper altogether. Risen said that the Times executive editor, Howell Raines, was believed by many at the paper to prefer stories that supported the case for war. In another anecdote, the former Times journalist recalled a scoop he had uncovered on a botched CIA plot. The Bush administration got wind of it and called him to the White House, where then National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice ordered the Times to bury the story. Risen said Rice told him, quote, to forget about the story, destroy my notes, and never make another phone call to discuss the matter with anyone. Risen wrote, the Bush administration was successfully convincing the press to hold or kill national security stories. And the Obama administration subsequently accelerated the war on the press. In the renowned study, Manufacturing Consent, the Political Economy of the Mass Media, Howard S. Herman and Chomsky articulated a propaganda model showing how the media serves and propagandizes on behalf of the powerful societal interests that control and finance them through the selection of correct thinking personnel and by the editors and working journalists' internalization of priorities and definitions of newsworthiness that conforms to the institution's policy. But in some cases, the relationship between U.S. intelligence agencies and the corporate media is not just one of mere ideological policing and direct pressure or friendship, but rather one of employment. In the 1950s, the CIA launched a covert operation called Project Mockingbird, in which it surveilled, influenced, and manipulated American journalists and media coverage explicitly in order to direct public opinion against the Soviet Union, China, and the growing international communist movement. Legendary journalist Carl Bernstein, a former Washington Post reporter who helped uncover the Watergate scandal, published a major cover story for Rolling Stone in 1977 titled The CIA and the Media: How the Most Powerful News Media Worked Hand in Glove with the Central Intelligence Agency and Why the Church Committee Covered It Up. Bernstein obtained CIA documents that revealed more than 400 American journalists in the previous 25 years had, quote, secretly carried out assignments for the Central Intelligence Agency. Bernstein wrote, some of these journalists' relationships with the agencies were tacit, some were explicit. There was cooperation, accommodation, and overlap. Journalists provided a full range of clandestine services, from simple intelligence gathering to serving as go-betweens with spies in communist countries. Reporters shared their notebooks with the CIA, editors shared their staffs. Some of the journalists were Pulitzer Prize winners, distinguished reporters who considered themselves ambassadors without portfolio for their country. Most were less exalted. Foreign correspondents who found that their associations with the agencies helped their work, stringers and freelancers who were as interested in the daring do of the spy business as in filing articles, and the smallest category, full-time CIA employees masquerading as journalists abroad. In many instances, CIA documents show journalists were engaged to perform tasks for the CIA with the consent of the managements of America's leading news organizations. Bernstein revealed that virtually all major U.S. outlets cooperated with the CIA, including ABC, NBC, the AP, UPI, Reuters, Newsweek, Hearst Newspaper, the Miami Herald, the Saturday Evening Post, and the New York Herald Tribune. He added, quote, "By far the most valuable of these associations, according to CIA officials, have been with the New York Times, CBS, and Time Inc." These layers of state manipulation, censorship, and even direct crafting of the news media show that as much as they claim to be independent, the New York Times and other outlets effectively serve as de facto spokespeople for the government, or at least for the U.S. national security state. And that's the same government today, folks, that's asking Google to back off on censorship. Leave your thoughts about this for the world, the Google Thought Police, and the CIA infiltrators at today's corporate news media organizations in the comments section below. If you guys enjoy these videos, be sure to subscribe to the channel, hit the bell notification icon, give it a thumbs up, and share it with everybody you know. Also, check out over 100 hard-hitting designs in the shirt store, and if you want to support more content, hit me up on Patreon or PayPal. All those links will be in the description and in the pinned comment. I'll see you guys in the next heavily censored shadow ban video.